Good afternoon. My name's Clive Davies, convener of the International Steering Group for EFUF. And I would like to welcome you to day 3, the final day of Urban Forestry for a Resilient Future, which is a feature of this afternoon and this year's European Forum on Urban Forestry Semester. This is a very different approach to the forum in 2021, an online event rather than a meeting in person. But we hope that we have found a way of bringing to you interesting and indeed hopefully some excitement as well in terms of the presentations that we have put together. I would particularly like to thank Manchester City of Trees for their contribution to organising this event, and also to EFUF's partners at the European Forest Institute, whose Zoom platform we're using for this event, and also to the Clearinghouse project. Clearinghouse is a Horizon 2020 project on urban forests as a nature-based solution. The event is taking place on Zoom, but is also being streamed live on Facebook. Little later on, I will give you further news about upcoming events, but at this point, I have pleasure in handing over to the moderator for this afternoon, Alan Simpson. Alan, it's your microphone, as we perhaps can say.
Right. Thank you for that introduction, Clive. As the governor, as we call him, in the European Forum on Urban Forestry. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Trees and Urban Design session. My name, as Clive said, is Dr. Alan Simpson. I'm Professor Emeritus of Landscape Architecture and Urban Forestry at Leeds Beckett University here in the UK. I have been involved in landscape architecture, urban design, urban forestry for all of my professional career, and still am, and I've worked in both public and private practice, including the UK New Towns. Currently the chair of the White Rose Forest, a community forest that covers more than 9,000 square kilometres of the north of England, and I'm getting more and more convinced that urban forestry is a key choreographer of planning, designing, implementing and managing our viable, resilient urban futures. Hence the theme of trees and urban design for this session this afternoon. 21st century is the urban century, and it's been forecast by the United Nations that urban areas across the world will have expanded by more than 2.4 million people by 2050, covering an area of in excess 1.2 million square kilometres. However, urbanisation is not a new phenomenon, and there have been many attempts over the years to design urban utopias to create the ideal urban experience. All too often, however, the speed of urbanisation has all too often compromised such attempts. And have we created urban dystopias rather than utopias? We have to put this right. But how can trees, the urban forest, green infrastructure be integral to the viable development of our towns and cities? How can we create places where people want to live, love, work and play healthily? We have 4 speakers this afternoon who hail from diverse backgrounds and who will explore how urban green and urban forestry is creatively and increasingly helping our urban people to positively engage with natural processes and reconciliation ecology, and thus help to create the viable futures for themselves and our towns and cities. Each speaker will present for 15 to 20 minutes maximum. And after the second speaker has concluded her presentation, we'll take a short 5-minute comfort break so you can recharge your wine glass or engage in other comforting activities. Audio and video will be muted and turned off for the participants during the session to assist the technology, but the session will be recorded. Do please ask questions of the speakers. Although we will not be taking questions after each speaker, we will be holding a question and answer session after the fourth speaker has concluded his presentation. If you want to pose a question, could you please use the Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen? The chat function will be disabled, and we will endeavour to engage with as many questions and comments as we can. Do please keep your questions short, sharp, and to the point. This isn't a place for you to publish the draft of your latest paper. Please add your name and affiliation to your question and the speaker whom you wish to address. Most grateful for your cooperation. So, without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, who is Professor Greg Keefe. Greg is Professor of Sustainable Architecture and Director of Research, also Head of the School of Natural and Built Environment at Queen's University in Belfast. He's an architect and urban designer with over 30 years' experience in sustainability and energy use and their impact upon the design of built form and urban space. He has had extensive experience of working closely with architects, urban designers, planners in developing exciting ways of reinvigorating the city through the application of innovative, sustainable technologies. He is of the view that cities are the most complex thing that mankind has ever designed, and that they are increasingly full of wicked problems that need sorting out if they are to become sustainable and resilient. Accordingly, he is the Sustainability and Architectural Advisor to the Northern Ireland Assembly, and he is also Expert Advisor to the EU. The title of his presentation is Fast-Moving Landscapes, Climate Adaptation and Urban Trees. And Greg, the floor is yours, sir.
Thanks very much, Alan. I sounded quite good then. You made me sound very good. I'm just going to share my screen now. So hopefully you can see the first slide. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Hello everyone, and I hope you enjoy this presentation. I've come to the urban treescape quite late in my career, really, and a lot to do with a PhD student of mine who is now a research fellow at Queen's, Keefe, who's a landscape architect. And we became very interested in climate change and urban forestry and green infrastructure, and how the two might work together and how they might complement each other, and also how one might solve the other's problems. And this first slide, you can see in a rather jokey way, I've photoshopped a sort of movable landscape onto some tram tracks in Manchester, as if we can move forests as quickly as climate change is moving. And obviously, one of the really interesting things about the future is it's going to be a warm future and a very interesting future. This you can, if you want, download hourly weather data for various places in the UK from the Met Office website. And I've plotted these on what's called a psychometric chart, which is a plot of temperature and humidity for every hour of the day, for every day of the year, for various scenarios. And this is a typical year that we're experiencing now. And as you can see, you know, most temperatures in Manchester, England, are below 20 degrees centigrade, and it very seldom gets colder than -5. But in the UK, you know, trees are already quite a lot out of range, you know, up to 100 kilometers out of range already from the warming we've had so far. And by 2030, they could be even 300 kilometers out of range. And this is going to cause serious issues for non-movable and even movable creatures, because obviously the movable creatures rely on and usually have close environmental connection with the stationary things such as trees. The interesting thing is, if you start to look at some of the scenarios for the future, this is a high emissions scenario for 1 year in the decade 2040 to 2050, and you can see that the climate is very different by 2050 in Manchester. You can see that now there's no frost days, and the summer can get as hot as 35 or more degrees centigrade, and that's a very different climate. And actually, if you take the summer and look at it, it's actually the same as the summer in Nice, France, now, which is incredible, isn't it? And you think of the treescape of the south of France, and that climate will soon be in Manchester in 30 years' time. You know, very, very interesting. And if we take that further, you know, the furthest the really detailed date information goes at the moment from the Met Office is to 2080. And now we've got a hot, humid climate, slightly different. It's actually the same, amazing. The summer is the same as Casablanca at the moment, which is incredible, isn't it? By 2080, we'll have 1 year in 10 having a summer similar to Casablanca. And obviously that creates an incredible challenge for treescapes, I think. And Manchester itself as a place is already suffering from heat island effect. As you can see from here, the centre of Manchester is 2 degrees hotter than the periphery of the city. And I was wondering whether that temperature change could actually help with tree migration. Because I think one of the interesting thing is when you look at a map of the UK in terms of annual mean temperature, you can see that Greater Manchester in the middle of the map there, in the north of England, actually has a climate quite similar to the south of England. So it already has a climate that's pretty similar to somewhere 200 kilometers further south, inside the city centre. So one of our ideas was then to use that temperature differential to seed a future forest that would survive climate change, that could live 200 miles further north than is possible outside the city. And then that forest would grow in the city. It would cool the city, or at least control the temperature rise of the city. And meanwhile, the rest of the country would warm with global warming, and the trees would therefore be a separate extension of the southern forest that could then extend into the landscape and preserve that thing. And actually, there's sort of various scenarios post Ice Age, where this sort of isolated external community of trees was thought to have been present in various niches around the globe that helped to recolonize once the ice had withdrawn. So I think it's a possibility. So this set of diagrams here shows clearly how the strategy would work. First, you'd collect seeds, and I call it assisted migration in a way, that we might collect seeds and seedlings from their native ranges. We'd then assemble those in the city, and then they would then grow in the city. And then as the temperature rose around, they would then sort of disperse into the environment from that place, which would mean that the forest wouldn't have to move as quickly as climate. And at the moment, the difference, climate's moving roughly at 10 kilometers a year. So it makes a difference. It would make quite a significant difference. And so if we look at the urban stepping stones, if you look at we've got a graph here of temperature and time, you could sort of see that the existing territory quite quickly would normally go outside the acceptable range for the trees. And what we'd find is that this urban territory would be kept in a temperature zone which was suitable for the trees, and eventually the ex-urban territory around the city would match that territory in terms of climate, and it would allow expansion into the hinterland of the city, which I think is quite an interesting idea. Further work we've done then start to look at how permeable the city is in order to allow for urban treescapes to migrate through the city. That's obviously an interesting thing, because particularly, throughout England, we live in an urbanized landscape, and actually there aren't large areas of contiguous forest through Britain, and actually around the world, not so many either. And particularly with the amount of urbanization in places like China and India, getting everything sort of pocketed. So we're wondering whether there's a way of improving the connectivity of forests through cities. And the idea, we try and move the city by using seed dispersal agents, which are basically birds, to move seeds from one location to another in the city, and allow the forest to migrate through natural propagation. We obviously, the city is a very complex space. We have, obviously these are 4 areas of Greater Manchester, and you can see it goes from 90% solid urban coverage to 10% urban coverage, and obviously it's quite a complex space when you look at it in terms of green infrastructure. And as an urbanist, we spend a lot of time looking at connectivity in cities, and we use a piece of software or methodology called space syntax, which looks at the connectivity of roads and houses to each other, which gives some idea of the permeability for walking, for example. And so what Yao and myself have done, we've modified that methodology to create a series of connective tissues that show how the city is currently permeable to birds, considering their differing home ranges and differing habitats. And it's really interesting as you build these models, because they become quite sophisticated. And you can see here, we're looking at Greater Manchester here, and you can see there are places that are really well connected and places that are completely not connected. And we can then, using the software, develop a series of flows associated with those, with the potential for movement for birds. We're using 3 different species of bird that move seeds here. We're using coal tits, siskins, and jays, a big bird, a small bird, and a medium-sized bird, really, that move alder, birch, and oak. And one of the really interesting things is that obviously this map might tell us where we need to put trees to make the environment more permeable. And it's really interesting, as we start to build that, we thought of 2 different strategies. We could start planting trees along streets and putting trees in gardens that were big enough to take a tree, to see if we could improve the connectivity. And secondly, we looked at establishing larger woodlands in open space around the city. And it's really interesting when you look at the connectivity that you get from following these strategies. Obviously, large patches allow for birds to rest and create population hubs, but small connective tissue can deal with day-to-day movement of birds in a different sort of way. So they both work. And as we build the home ranges of different birds into the map of space syntax, you can see that jays travel more. So actually there's sort of a better connection in some ways in this landscape for jays, but actually the coal tits are more connected locally. And we can work with those things to then model how to make the city more permeable. So here's the permeability on the left for the jay currently, with its daily home range. And if you look at, after strategy 1 of planting street trees, we make an incredible difference to the permeability of the city for birds, and therefore for the seed transfer within that. And as we multiply those things up, we can develop this sort of urban model that really can tell you where to put trees, really, in order to improve the connectivity for climate migration in the city. And so we don't have to turn the city into a complete forest. We can choose places that make the most difference, and that's really what we've done. We're now extending the work. It's been very useful, the pandemic, because I found out that the supercomputer at Queen's University wasn't being used because the university was pretty much closed. And so Yao and I occupied the supercomputer for 3 months with no one else on it, and we built a full world model now of forests in the world, and we're looking at their connectivity to each other and their ability to move and across the globe, and it's starting to create a really interesting world model for climate connectivity of protected forests. And one of the really interesting thing is, and we're working on this at the moment, is that Europe itself has quite a lot of forests, but actually it's very poorly connected, and so we're working on a strategy to look at a wide scale reconnection of European forests in that space, which we hope to put a paper together by the summer with a bit of luck, which I think is quite interesting. So just to conclude, I suppose space syntax gives us a new way of understanding the city treescape as a network, and as an urbanist, I'm sort of interested in sort of networks. I think it's quite easy to make cities more permeable to climate refugee species, and I think by a sophisticated understanding of the spatial arrangement of things, we can target trees in places where it really matters, you know, which may not be obvious to people on the ground. I think the urban heat island effect is quite interesting because obviously it can be remedied by the large scale planting of trees, but it also gives us a chance to create refugee hotspots further north, which may be really useful to aid migration and amelioration of climate change and its effect on biodiversity in the future. I think the model still needs to be extended. I think we've just put a bid in with UCRI, the UK research funders, to look at treescapes to extend the model to include more things such as soil types and other ecological factors, working with people who are more ecologically orientated. And finally, I think it's been quite interesting to note that Europe's treescape is poorly connected from our viewpoint for forest migration, which I think it might be quite an interesting thing for future work for this group. So thanks very much. I hope there'll be some good questions about the work, and thanks for letting me speak. I shall stop sharing.
Thank you, Greg, for a very pertinent presentation. As you say or suggest, last time when the ice age disappeared and things had to start moving northwards, it wasn't a problem because there was nothing in the way. And now, of course, there is, called towns and cities. And the presumption is, or I think has been, that it's not very easy for things to move through. But the work that you've done and continuing to do is showing that actually it's not totally impossible for things to move through the city. And I think that's excellent.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Alan. I think yeah, we were surprised at how permeable the city was actually, even as is, you know, and I think you could certainly improve it with relatively limited resources, I think, which might be quite interesting for something like City of Trees, you know, and where they put their trees, you know, in the future. Yeah.
Well, I think, you know, and relying on our feathered songsters to do the work for us, yes, exactly. I think is excellent. Yeah. There will, and I'm not going to go into it now, be issues, of course, of introducing non-native trees and things for our downs and cities, but that's a different project and what have you. Interestingly, there was a proposal when we were doing the cost action a long time ago to actually have an urban forest from Scandinavia right the way down to northern Italy, and to join things up. Right. It would be very different as you went through each country, obviously, and it wouldn't just be one thing applied willy-nilly, but okay, it was an idea and hasn't got any further than that really. But I think there are thoughts, as you suggest, happening that things have got to be connected up. And it's the sooner the better, really.
Yeah, and I suppose the interesting thing is how big and wide and how varied the connection needs to be. Whether you need a complete forest, I suppose, is more the interesting piece of work perhaps that we're trying to do at the moment using the supercomputer, is to try and see, how much treescape you really need to keep the permeability for different creatures. I think would be really, really interesting, I think.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you, Greg. That's an excellent start to the afternoon. So very grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed. And can I talk to all folks who are listening? Questions are very much required and on the agenda. So any thoughts you might have or comments, please stick them into the Q&A. Okay, we move on to our second speaker for the afternoon. And that's Katie Locke. Katie, as Director of Communities and the Frederick Osborne Fellow at the Town and Country Planning Association, oversees TCPA's work on new and renewed communities and leads TCPA's campaigns and promotion of Garden City principles in policy, in legislation, education, and the arts. This involves working at all levels of government and with a wide range of public, private, and third sector organisations and individuals at all stages of planning, design, and delivery. She leads the TCPA's ongoing research on transferable lessons from the post-war new towns and works supporting new town authorities through the New Town Network and the all-party parliamentary group. She's the trustee for Planning Aid for London, is a chartered town planner, and has a background in planning, urban design, and sustainability. Before joining the TCPA, she worked in the private sector as an environmental planning consultant and has authored several books on issues to do with new towns, copies of which I have and read, and they're very good. I can recommend them. The title of her talk is Trees and Green Infrastructure in the New Town. So, Katie, the floor is yours, ma'am.
Alan, thank you very much for that introduction and for reading the books and enjoying them. Thanks so much for that. As you said, I hope you can see and hear me okay. I'm spending sort of 15-20 minutes, a slightly different presentation, providing a bit of a background to some of the lessons from history about how the management of trees and green infrastructure in urbanism can help us understand how to manage new places today and how to regenerate the new towns themselves. Just for the benefit of those who might not know about the Town and Country Planning Association, just really briefly, we were founded in 1899 originally to promote the Garden City movement, but today we're an independent campaigning and research charity working on all aspects of the built and natural environment. We've just released a new 5-year strategic plan setting out our work to support the creation of healthy, sustainable and resilient places that are fair for everyone. And that does include work on new communities and healthy places. But of particular interest to this group, we run, for example, the Green Infrastructure Partnership on behalf of DEFRA. So do check that out. I hope some of our work will be of interest to you. Now, I will just start before the new towns with a bit of background on the garden cities, because this is all part of the same story, and I think it's interesting to see where some of this learning came from. Now, in 1898, Ebenezer Howard wrote Tomorrow, a Peaceful Path for Real Reform, and this book which set out the garden city idea, which brought together a whole range of ideas from a whole history of the utopian tradition and the cooperative movement and the arts and crafts movement, all of these things brought these ideas together. And his idea was to bring together the best of town, so the jobs, employment opportunities, social networks, transport networks of the town, with the best of the countryside, so access to fresh air and green space and space to grow food. And by combining these places in new garden cities, we create places that were healthy and genuinely affordable for people to live in. What was really radical about the idea was that it was underpinned by a system of participative democracy, which enabled people to share in the profits of the development and help pay in the long term for the creation of these beautiful, healthy and green places. Now, that concept of stewardship is something we'll be talking a lot about, and it's what really connects the original garden city idea with some of the places we want to develop today. And talking about trees in particular, which I'm trying to really focus on the trees aspect of this story today, they were absolutely fundamental to the idea of the garden cities, and partly that was to do with, yes, the idea of tree-lined streets and access to nature, but that design is almost a distraction from the real aspect of the garden city idea which set it apart, which was this: it's really about a moral philosophy of how we might live, how we can really enable everyone to have access to healthy living. And the picture here, I love this picture. This, you can see Ebenezer Howard in the hat in the middle. This is Arbor Day in 1913, where the whole town were to get together every year and plant trees in the garden city. So that access to nature for well-being and quality of life was really fundamental to the garden city idea. But following the delivery of two garden city experiments and then skipping forward to the Second World War, there was a real feeling that the garden cities weren't delivering fast enough, and to deal with the impacts of the Second World War, the huge amount of housing loss and the need for a new future, there was going to need to be a new approach to the way we plan and deliver places. And for many years before the end of the Second World War, there had been discussions about how we might plan strategically for the creation of new settlements in England. And by 1946, the New Towns Act had been passed, which was legislation which set out how development corporations, these powerful bodies, could be created with the powers and resources necessary to deliver sustainable new communities with designated land designated by the Secretary of State, within which these new communities would be built. And you can see there on the right, that's the picture of Milton Keynes Development Corporation, I think in 1973, already enjoying the trees of Milton Keynes. And on the left, you can see there that the programme would eventually deliver 32 new towns across the United Kingdom, which today provide homes for over 2.8 million people. Now, the New Town programme wasn't just about creating housing, it was about a whole integrated approach to creating new opportunities for a new society, about creating balanced communities. So huge investment was made in community facilities, in public art, in community activities, to make sure that everybody had access to a good quality of life, and recognising the role of art and a busy social life in having a good quality of life right from the outset. But just as important as these balanced communities and quality of life was making sure that these new towns were healthy and green places. They were heavily influenced by the garden city movement, but it was really interesting in the new towns that there'd been a whole series of learning from across, particularly with North America, and it was really in the new towns where the ideas, the sort of ethos of the garden city movement collided with all of the new ideas of modernism, and that's really reflected in the way the post-war new towns were designed and built. But you can see from some of the pictures here, it's quite frustrating today because we're not in the office. I'm not able to access the office. We've got fantastic archives of images of the new towns, which I will send a link to, but you can see some here. The development corporations continued to be tasked with this idea of marrying town and country, making sure that people could access work and transport using with walkable neighbourhoods, making sure there were fantastic cycling facilities. That there was really a holistic approach and a landscape-led approach to design. Now, lots of people think about post-war new towns and they think about concrete development, really not appreciating the huge efforts that were put into the landscape design of these places. And that was about partly creating a sense of place in a new environment. The development corporations employed huge numbers of staff. They had the resources to do that, underwritten by low interest government loans, huge staff bodies, which included, really importantly, something we quite often miss today when we're developing new places, which is all of those skills and expertise that you need to deliver. So there were, alongside the architects, there were landscape architects and ecologists and landscape managers and whole teams just tasked with this landscape idea. Many of the new towns noted in some of the books are Basildon and Cumbernauld and Peterborough, some of the other examples I'll talk about. Put aside huge resources specifically for tree planting. They had their own tree nurseries, and because new towns are developed over a long period of time, they don't just appear overnight, they take 20, 30 plus years to mature. Many of the development corporations put huge efforts into retaining mature trees on site where possible, which could help to create a sense of place right for the early residents. Now, many of these things you would sort of consider to be given for good urban design in new places today, but they really had their roots in the garden cities and new towns movements. And later new towns like Milton Keynes really integrated green infrastructure and SUDs, for example. And I took this quote at the bottom from, there is a fantastic book by Frank Schaffer about the new town story, and he highlighted how new towns were about the moulding of environmental influences to achieve economic and social gains. So that green infrastructure was really an important part of creating that positive quality of life for people that lived in the new towns. Now, I'm just going to touch really briefly on 3 examples here. The first of which is Telford New Town, which was designated in 1963, and it was originally called Dawley New Town. To check I haven't gone too far. No, it originally designated not only to provide overspill from urban centres near Telford, but also the regeneration of the coalfield area. Now, I have to be careful talking about Telford because our chair, Alan Simpson, I believe, worked for the Development Corporation and on the landscape structure plan, which was one of the really fundamental successes of the landscape structure of Telford. It was updated every 5 years, and it really sought to make sure that the design of Telford New Town meant that the built form was subservient to the landscape. It became a settlement in the landscape, not on top of the landscape, and the term Telford, the forest city, emerged from that. Around 40% of the town is actually a forested area, and there was a 10-year afforestation programme which planted 6.5 million trees, and it was the first town in the UK to get forest stewardship certification. Now you can see an extract from the landscape plan on the right, so it's not great quality, but hopefully you get a sense there of this landscape structure. You can see the bottom picture shows one of the cycleways with that forested area either side, and then you get a bit of a sense of this view from the town park as well. And perhaps none of those images are what would immediately spring to mind when you think about Telford as a new town. The second example I've got here is actually Mark 1 new town, Cumbernauld, which again, when you picture Cumbernauld, quite often the image that springs to mind is of what was nicknamed its Carbuncle Town Centre. It's actually one of the greenest new towns of the 32. It's absolutely stunning. I highly recommend going up to visit it. It was originally identified in the Clyde Valley Regional Plan in 1946 to accommodate Glasgow overspill, but there had been other new towns designated before it, like Harlow and Stevenage and others. But then Cumbernauld was slightly different. This hilltop town took a whole place approach to design, but it departed from the new town neighbourhood principles of the earlier Mark 1 new towns. It had higher densities, and it was a town of 2 halves. But it also had, and this is another characteristic of the development corporations and their young talented staff teams, is that in some of the housing areas the architects were given free rein to do whatever they wanted in some respects. There's really fantastic experimental architecture. But what really brings all of that together is the landscape framework for Cumbernauld. More than 50% of Cumbernauld is green space, 23% of it is actually tree cover. And you can see some of that in the picture at the top there. But it's a really important part of the future of Cumbernauld, and there's some brilliant projects, the Cumbernauld Living Landscape Project, which is a partnership between different organisations, which is really looking to manage that fantastic landscape for people and biodiversity. And the third example I'm going to use is Milton Keynes, designated in 1967. Now, Milton Keynes is kind of unusual. There's huge, great lessons from it, but it had had the advantage of learning from all of the new towns that had come before it, and given its strategic location and others, there were advantages that Milton Keynes had above other new towns. But in terms of its green infrastructure and its management of trees and green infrastructure, it's fascinating lessons there. Now, the picture in the bottom right, I couldn't find the picture I wanted from some of the original landscape design of MK, but it's famous for its grid system, its transport grid. What people don't appreciate is that actually this lazy grid is known as a lazy grid because it follows the landscape, the original landscape pattern that was there, some of the key green and blue infrastructure corridors, and along those were going to be local centres, and then within those the neighbourhood areas. And the master plan by Llewellyn Davies, Weeks, Forestier, Walker and Ball in 1967, they had just come from designing Washington Newtown, and you can really see some of the influences there, but they really had an integrated approach to landscape, everything considered. There was 2 years of work that went into before they actually designed the structure itself. Everything from soil preservation to biodiversity and well-being was considered in terms of the GI and landscape of Milton Keynes. And there are all sorts of things that, like, there was originally, current council say that they're not sure this was the case, but some of the original MK pioneers are clear that the intention was that no building in Milton Keynes was to be above the tree line, so that when you looked at Milton Keynes from the air, you saw a forest of trees with some buildings in it, not vice versa. And one of the, actually I'm going to flip back to the next one because it does illustrate that. I couldn't get to the office, though. I couldn't get all the pictures I wanted from this book here, The Architecture and Planning of Milton Keynes by Derek Walker, who was their chief architect for some time. And I do recommend this book to you if you're interested in landscape architecture and design, because it really shows the story and influence of it. And this picture on the right is from that book, and it illustrates how he imagined the trees would grow up around the urbanism of Milton Keynes, so that's what you would see. And actually that was the case for many years, until probably only about 15 years ago that some high density buildings were built in the centre of Milton Keynes, which are above that skyline. But you can just see here, these pictures I think are really powerful because they show the power of having this landscape framework. This isn't a Derek Walker quote at the top, but I think it illustrates it really well. You build this trellis, this landscape-based trellis within which the new town can grow. And the power of that is illustrated by these images on the bottom left. So the two here, they're amazing Derek Jacobi illustrations here from the 1960s, which show what it was intended to look like. And these images on the right are what Milton Keynes looks like today. So you can really see the power of that landscape infrastructure. Now, one of the other fantastic lessons from Milton Keynes about green infrastructure is about this important issue of stewardship. When the post-war New Towns programme was prematurely wound up in the 1980s, the assets of the new towns were sold off to the private sector or given to local authorities, many of which those assets became liabilities. And most places don't have the resources to look after this fantastic green infrastructure, which was built by the development corporations. In Milton Keynes, some of the people that were working at the Development Corporation established something called the Parks Trust, which they endowed with land and some financial resources to manage Milton Keynes green infrastructure going forward. And as a result of that, Milton Keynes has some of the best well-maintained green infrastructure in the country. And it was only Milton Keynes and with the Neen Park Trust in Peterborough that put those stewardship provisions in place, and all of the other new towns are today struggling to manage their green infrastructure and because they don't have the resources to do so. The Parks Trust manages 5,000 acres of parkland and over 22 million trees. So lots of examples to get from there. I don't want to take up or too much more of the time I've been allocated, but just sharing some of the lessons about the way that the new towns were developed around their renewal. with that premature winding up of the new town and the dissolution of the assets, it means, as I said, many places lack the resources to properly look after their green infrastructure. It's become a liability, as it has in most towns, for councils who just can't afford to look after these places. But for those new towns where there was a particular emphasis on the provision of trees and green infrastructure, it's difficult to maintain that. And where it's not maintained, it's having an impact on usage of things like cycleways and some of that other sustainable transport networks. People feel unsafe if stuff's overgrown and not looked after properly. But they were some of the issues that were highlighted in the research that we did. Many of the new towns were traditionally designed at a fairly low density, and either for financial reasons, councils are under pressure to either develop the green space or to densify the housing areas to get more housing in there, which obviously has implications for not only the green infrastructure, but one of the interesting aspects, I think, particular to the new towns, is some people, particularly some of those early pioneers of the new towns, people that moved there in the early days, they had been sold this story, this vision of living in this town and country environment with access to green space. So the densification of those areas is sort of a challenge to the vision that they had originally bought into when they moved to this new place, which is sort of an aspect that's particular to the new towns. Of course, as we just heard, the need to adapt to the climate crisis, the need to do urban greening, particularly in some of the town centres. But as the assets were sold off with the new towns, many of the town centres were sold off completely into private ownership, which has made it really difficult for local authorities, for example, to green some of the 1960s town centres, some of which are sort of those monolithic concrete town centres and really do require urban greening to adapt to the climate challenge. But there are huge opportunities. We think some new powers for new type of development corporations for the new town councils, and some of the expansion of some of those stewardship approaches which were taken in Milton Keynes and Peterborough, whether we can use those to help assist in the renewal of the existing new towns. And there's also huge opportunities with that green infrastructure, opportunities around new approaches to provision of local food and energy around lots of the new town housing estates, lots of grassland which can be managed proactively for those purposes. And I can see I'm running hideously over time, so I'm going to just skip forward 2 slides. Taking all of those lessons today, we've been working on understanding how modernised garden city principles can be used to influence the way we design and build new communities today. And green infrastructure is a fundamental aspect of that. And many of the new communities are looking at how to do that, providing community orchards, providing some of these new opportunities for edible garden cities, and integrating green infrastructure management and social and community facilities as well. And we've written guidance about all of those things, which I do recommend to you. But I will my closing comments are really about one of these lessons, which takes us back to the garden city idea originally, is about this idea of stewardship. There's one lesson from the Garden Cities and New Towns programme we can take forward, is that there's an opportunity there. There is value in the development process to set up stewardship models which enable you to look after fantastic green infrastructure and trees in new communities in perpetuity. We know how to do it, we just need the political will and resources to do that. So I will leave it there. If you want to hear more about new towns, this is one of the books that Alan mentioned, and happy to answer some questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Katie. That was a wonderful presentation, and interesting about Telford. We won't ask any questions at the moment, but I think it's interesting that a lot of the things that we did in new towns have actually been forgotten about. Things like common service trenches for housing areas, for example, so that you could plant more trees. And one of the first jobs I had when I first went to Telford was to fix where the 60 dBA contour was from the major roads. And I thought, why? And they said, because we will not plant any, not build any houses closer to major roads than the 60 dBA contour. So you've got 50, possibly 60 meters of land to plant, put cycleways and what have you. And you thought, wow, Yes. So why aren't we doing this now?
That is so interesting. I won't talk anymore, but just that one example with big roads in Milton Keynes, they were intentionally designed to be wider than they needed to be, so that if future evolution in transport developed, there was space to create other types of transport networks along there, having that sort of long-term view and flexibility. In the same way, having those combined service trenches, it's those details that are forgotten.
Well, thank you very much, and wonderful.